So the subject here is how you can modify your landscape, things you plant and how you maintain them to affect insects. And its title here is Gardening for Insects or Not. I'm not going to be talking about the not part. We have not enough time to get into everything, but plants, as I'll talk a lot, are going to be able to provide certain materials for insects. Might be obviously things like nectar and pollen, but also can provide places where they might nest. The kinds of things we could be talking about on this talk would be things like butterflies, hummingbird moths, miller moths, honeybees, bumblebees, all the various kinds of solitary bees, the natural enemies of insect pests, the biocontrols, things that come into our houses that came from our yard, or what I call double or nothing insects. These are insects that are particularly aphids. If you have two plants, they're a problem. They need two plants to complete their life cycle. Anyway, but in the interest of time, I'm going to not talk about butterflies. You've heard about butterflies forever. I'm not going to talk about honeybees. You know, they're not a native bee to begin with, but you've heard about honeybees plenty. So I'm going to start with natural enemy kinds of insects. But basically, in this whole subject of gardening for insects, what you have to kind of think is, what does the insect need in order to live well? And the kinds of things that insects need are similar in many ways to what we need. I mean, they might need certain kind of food when they're growing up. They might need different kinds of food when they're adults. That might need some shelter, and we don't want to kill them. That would be the other thing, freedom from being slaughtered unnecessarily. So food for the young. An example here would be things like butterflies or moths. Obviously, the caterpillar feeds differently from the butterfly or moth. So in order to have the whole life cycle be completed, you need not only flowers for the adults to feed on for nectar, but you need whatever the caterpillar feeds on. So painted lady is an example, one of the more common butterflies that we have, although it is a migrant from the southwestern United States and northern and Mexico. Anyway. But that butterfly, as a caterpillar, would feed on things like thistles, hollyhock, mallows, a couple other plants. If you wanted to increase the numbers of that insect in your yard, those would be the kind of plants you'd want to have. Food needs for the adults, those could be a little bit different. There are many kinds of insects that, when they're adults, they'll switch off and feed on something totally different. So the main one that we'll talk about in just a sec will be the things that are natural enemies of other insects, things like lady beetles and the like, and many of them in the adult stage are going to feed on nectar and pollen. The young stage feeds on bugs. The adult stage feeds on nectar and pollen. Shelter. Shelter is pretty much mostly needed if the insect takes care of the young in some way, provides a nest site for them. Most insects don't do that. I mean, they just dump the eggs and run. But there are some where there's going to be some kind of care, at least maternal care. So shelter might be needed, for instance, if we're going to talk about some of the bees that nest in cavities, like leafcutter bees, that they might use a stem of a plant as a nest site, or a borehole or something like that. Well, we can provide them. So people, maybe you have some of these yourself, where you have a bee box or something it's got little holes drilled in it for various kinds of things to have a cavity to nest in. And then we talk a little bit more generally about the role of debris, sheltering debris to get through the winter. This whole, maybe you've heard of the leaves kind of issue. And so that often a lot of the value of that, at least for insects, is it provides some insulating cover to get through the winter better. But I'll come back to that. So the first thing that I want to talk about issue would be these natural enemies, the insects that eat other insects, and how does landscaping affect them. So for this group, I would start with saying the first thing would be learn to recognize them. Then talk about the food needs for the adults, food needs for the immature stages, the young, and nest sites if required. But I put I put learn to recognize them and don't kill them in the beginning here, because this is a group of insects that sometimes they do get inadvertently killed by people who don't want to do that. And that's because they can look really different in different stages. I mean, take lady beetles. I mean, everybody knows lady beetles, and most lady beetles are pretty, identifiable as being lady beetles. They're boldly patterned, brightly colored. They look like a lady beetle. However, they are a beetle, and as a result, they have complete metamorphosis, meaning they are going to have eggs that are going to be some kind of immature stage, a larva, and the larva looks totally different from the adult, just like a caterpillar looks different from a butterfly. And then when they're done, they'll pupate, and so it's important to recognize them. So with lady beetles, the most common ones we see are ones that lay their eggs in masses on leaves. And the eggs are laid in a mass of maybe a half dozen to 2 or 3 dozen. Here's one laying eggs there in this photo, or this video. But they tend to be kind of spindle shaped, and they'll be laid on a plant regardless of what kind of plant that is, as long as there's something for their young to eat. So if it's got aphids on it or some other prey, they'll lay their eggs on it. Lady beetle eggs don't look like much else that we get around here. So if you see elm leaf beetle on elm trees, not that common anymore, but their eggs sort of look like that. On cottonwood, there's a cottonwood leaf beetle. Their eggs sort of look like that, but they're just on cottonwoods. And not too much else. And lady beetles will lay their eggs everywhere. But I know people who have squashed lady beetle eggs, have sprayed plants for lady beetle, because they saw lady beetle eggs, because they didn't know. Or you get the larvae, and the larvae look totally different. And the larvae are the most predatory stage. They eat far more than the adults. These are teenagers. So they're just slamming down aphids, dozens of aphids a day, whereas the adults are mostly sitting around sipping on some nectar. But they look really different, and they're active hunters. And they, unless you knew about what a lady beetle larva looked like, you see something like that wandering on your plant, many people freak out, and they pick them off, or they spray. And then I show a picture like this, and this has happened several times over the years. I see somebody going, "Oh, doe! I didn't know. That's a lady beetle larvae. I was picking them off. Oh, I feel terrible." Anyway, so a lot of times they get accidentally killed. Provide food needs for the adults. Now, lady beetle larvae are feeding on bugs. Lady beetle adults might be feeding on some bugs, but mostly they're feeding on nectar and pollen. And this goes for all the other kinds of insects that we could talk about that are predators, of common predators in our yards. There's a group of insects called the green lacewings, because the adults are green and have a lacy wing, just adorable looking little insects. But the larvae are arguably the meanest thing in your backyard, and they're the predator. The adults are feeding on nectar and pollen. The larvae, they're slaughtering whatever they want. I mean, it could be an aphid here, but I mean, it's taking out a well-muscled cabbage loop or caterpillar. A lady beetle couldn't do that. They've got those jaws that they can use to impale their prey, and a little blood groove down the inside. Anyway, but the point is, for this, is that the adults need nectar and pollen to keep going. If there's no nectar and pollen, they'll die earlier, or they'll go somewhere else. You want them to be in your yard and be there to lay eggs and produce young that will feed on pests that are in your yard. Another group of predators that I think go underneath the radar but are really common are flies in the family called syrphid flies, or flower flies, or hover flies. Syrphid, it's the name of the family is Syrphidae, so that's probably the best way to call them. But these are flies that are very common at flowers, but many of them look just like bees. They're great. Some of them are super mimics of bees. They can't sting, they can't bite, they try to look like something could hurt you. Total bluff. But anyway, they're feeding on the flowers. The larvae of these flower flies are often the most important predator of aphids on trees and shrubs in particular. They don't look like much. You don't often notice them. The larvae are little maggots, so they don't even have a distinct head. They don't have legs. They just kind of ooze over the surface of the plant, but the front part of their head, they've got little mouth hooks that they can use to rip and tear into whatever prey they capture, in this case, grinding up a little aphid. They can just annihilate a colony. But they sustain themselves in the adult stage on nectar. All the things we talked about sustain themselves on nectar, and all the things I'm going to talk about right now sustain themselves on nectar in the adult stage. So there's two different main kinds of groups of insects that attack other insects. One are the predators that have young that move around and hunt. The mother lays eggs somewhere and the young then hunt. The others are parasitoids. These are ones where the mother hunts, inserts her eggs in or on whatever is the right kind of insect for that, and then their young live inside it and kill it internally. Kind of gross, but kind of cool too. But anyway, the adults feed on nectar and pollen. The same thing, there's a group of flies, tachinid flies, just look like a lot of kinds of flies, but these ones lay their eggs on other insects. Their young hatch from the egg, they go into the body of that insect, and then that insect is killed. So this would be a caterpillar killed by some tachinid flies. Anyway, we could talk about these all day. I'd like to show you plenty more pictures of all of these, but the point here is, how do we encourage these? So flowers is the source of nectar and pollen for most of these, but what kinds of flowers? Different flowers are used by these insects. These have got little tiny mouth parts, so they don't have a long tongue that could go into a clover blossom or a petunia, for goodness sake. They need the little shallow stuff. So if you're landscaping in a way to encourage the activity of some of these natural enemies, you want little flowers, little tiny flowers, often that make little umbels. So what are examples of that? Anything in the carrot family, Apiaceae. I mean, they're dill, coriander, ammi, Queen Anne's lace, many other kinds of plants, fennel. These are all plants that they will access easily. And these would be part of any gardening plan that wanted to optimize the natural enemy activity in your yard. Not the big showy things. These are smaller flowered things. So any Apiaceae, some of the sedums have got little flowers that and even ooze nectar, so those would be accessible sources of nectar. Spurges, Sweet Alyssum, basket of gold, early flowering plant that's used as a nectar pollen source. Thyme and several of the mint family have got little tiny flowers, and you'll see these natural enemies feeding at those. But it'd be a different suite of plants than if you wanted honeybees, to encourage honeybees, or a different suite if you wanted hummingbird moths, or a different suite of plants if you wanted solitary bees, some of the little solitary bees. Lots of plants work. Personally, the ones that I like are the white cultivars of ammi and moon carrot. Moon carrot is biennial, so it's a little harder to grow, but these can be just covered with bugs. I mean, I'll go out in my yard and just, oh my gosh, there's 20 insects on the head of an ammi or something. So I'm in heaven. That's what I want. So again, if a plant doesn't have a good bug associated with it, I'm not nearly as interested, no matter how it tastes. But I'd make some exceptions. Anyway, so you could just somehow put some of these plants in the mix in your yard. In this case, it's a purposeful planting of Sweet Alyssum in a field that provides the nectar and pollen sources for insects that will then feed on the insects that are on the cabbages and the like, or corn, or I guess that's some small grain, potatoes, I think. Anyway, can't remember. So providing food needs for the immature stages, this becomes more problematic because by definition, these are predators or parasitoids, so their young develop in another insect. So you have to have some insects. Otherwise, they're not going to increase their numbers. There has to be something for them to eat when they're young. So providing the food needs for the immature stages is what we have to deal with here. And how do you do it is that you tolerate, if not encourage, insects that aren't doing any damage, that are fed upon by natural enemies. So my personal example that I notice most often in my yard is an aphid that gets on bridal wreath spirea in my backyard. And that plant's been there since I moved there 40 years ago, and it's still there, and it grows like a weed. And I didn't even notice there were aphids on it for years. But then one year I noticed all the cottonwood fluff was sticking to the plant, and that's from the goo that the aphids are excreting, the honeydew. But anyway, the point is, though, that this plant has aphids every year, and the plant grows like a weed. It is not hurting the plant. I mean, these aphids are taking out a little fluid. You know, maybe I water it one more time than I might otherwise. But what is happening is they're not really hurting the plant, but they are serving as food for things that eat them. So lady beetles and lacewings and flower fly larvae are on these, and little wasps that live on the aphids, they're attacking these because these aphids are there. And then they build up their numbers so that then they can be available to feed on the aphids or other kinds of insects in my yard that do bother me. So like aphids on roses or aphids on aspen bother me, but not on this. These are good aphids. You know, they're an aphid, but they're not hurting anything, and they're providing me benefit by providing natural enemies a source of food. And, you know, another example, I don't have this plant anymore, but I had some rubber rabbit brush. I didn't even know there were aphids on rubber rabbit brush until one year I was just noticing tons of lady beetle larvae on them. The rubber rabbit brush grows like, you know, a weed anyway, but it grows fine. It is not affected by that aphid, and as a result, this plant is a benefit to me because it would provide an aphid that would then provide food, and the plant itself was not being hurt. A little complicated concept here, but this whole idea of encouraging natural enemies by landscape changes. There's a number of good books and stuff on them. I particularly like the ones that are put out by what's called the Xerces Society. But if you want to do a search on this whole subject of how to improve landscapes to optimize habitat for natural enemies, try searching on like conservation biological control. Those would be kind of keywords, and you'll get lots of little leads on where to read more about this whole subject. Nest sites for these natural enemies are not needed by most of the insects. Most of the insects that I talk about, the adults are, after they've laid their egg, they're gone. But there's one group of natural enemies of insects that make nests and provide food for their young. And these are what we call hunting wasps. And hunting wasps are different from the wasps that I think most people think of that make a colony like a paper wasp or a yellow jacket or bald-faced hornet. Hunting wasps are solitary wasps. The mother does all the work. She goes and finds or prepares some sort of nest cell where she will then provision it with food, and the food that she provisions it with is some kind of insect. Each one of these hunting wasps goes after different kinds of insects. She hunts it, she paralyzes it, she brings it back to the nest, brings it down into the bottom, and then lays an egg on that paralyzed insect, seals it up, and repeats. So as an example, the first ones I ever got good pictures of was camping out in western Colorado in a rifle, and noticed this one of these long, thin-bodied, thread-waisted wasps that go after caterpillars. It was, when I first saw it, it was filling in a hole actually, because then it took off and it wanted to seal the hole a little bit so that other things wouldn't get in. 20 minutes or so after it takes off, I look and oh my gosh, here it is returning, trundling this giant naked caterpillar that it got off of a chokecherry tree. And paralyzed, and she's carrying it. I'm sure it weighs many times more than she does. She then opens up the hole, drags it down underground, and then that's the, and then somewhere underneath there, she will lay an egg on it, seal it up, and her young will consume that paralyzed caterpillar. So lots of these hunting wasps. So this is one that nests in sandy sites that goes after flies. So they catch different flies, paralyze them, bring them back. There's a paralyzed fly underneath it, and then put it in a little hole in the soil. It usually takes 2 or 3 flies to provide enough of a meal to raise one young. But when she's got enough, she lays an egg on them, seals it up. The young will feed on those paralyzed flies. Meanwhile, she's making another little chamber and then she's provisioning with more kinds of flies and repeating. So that one goes after flies. This is another hunting wasp that nests in sandy soils too. It's in a slightly different group, and it goes after bugs, stink bugs and leaf-footed bugs. I'll show you. This though was the answer to a question that I'd received for many times over the years, where people were complaining about wasps nesting in their kids' sandbox. So the situation with this one was that I got brought to was in Longmont at a field, a park, and they had a little playground area. I'm not sure if you can see all the little zipping around things, but those are these sand wasps. The ones that are flying around all over the place, those are mostly males. The females make holes in the ground, excavate them out. When it's excavated, there's a sufficient chamber underneath the ground, and it goes down about 7 inches, little kind of J underneath the soil. When it's fully made, she'll go take off, seal it up a little bit. There's a male trying to bother her. Anyway, and then here she comes back with her prey. And the prey is this insect. It's a young of a leaf-footed bug. And so she reopens the hole and eventually zip goes in, and then later goes out, and then repeats the cycle. So this one is one that just goes after stinky bugs. No accounting for taste, but these are all insects that smell, and these are young stink bugs. These are another kind of stink bug, and these are young of what we call the western conifer seed bug. This one sometimes comes into houses, and it's kind of a big brownish insect with these long back legs. Anyway, for discouraging them, and this is essentially what they did, is they got rid of most of the sand and then covered it with that surface material. So no more wasp nests there anymore, which I'm not sure if the kids care. Makes the parents feel better, though. They were the ones who were complaining. Anyway, different wasps go after different insects. So this is one steel blue cricket hunter, and it hunts the field crickets, the black ones that are on the ground. Another kind of wasp goes after the crickets that are in trees and shrubs. This is the golden digger wasp that goes after grasshoppers and katydids, again, catches them, returns them to a hole in the ground, and then lays an egg on it and then seals it up. This is one you wouldn't get up here yet. Cicada killer. It goes after cicadas, particularly the big dog day cicadas, which are starting to creep up along the Front Range. I mean, when I first got to Colorado, they weren't in Denver, they weren't in Fort Collins, they were down in Pueblo. But as the urban forest has increased, they've been moving up, and so have the things that attack them. So these are the cicadas we're talking about. These are the ones that make big loud noises in trees. go to Pueblo if you want to hear them, a good chorus. Anyway, their most spectacular natural enemy is the cicada killers. And these look like giant mutant yellow jackets from hell. I mean, these are big, big, scary-looking wasps, but they just go after cicadas, paralyze them, and then return them to a hole they've dug that is as deep as 16 inches in the soil. Put them in the little side chamber, lay an egg on it if she wants to have a male, gets another cicada, 2 cicadas, and if she'll lay a female egg, she can control all that. Anyway, and repeats. So, but the ones that you're going to see more likely are little ones. So little ones that hunt little things like aphids or leafhoppers or little tiny flies. And one common genus is Pemphirodon, and you might see them excavating out of a pruning cut on a pithy plant like a rose or a raspberry or something like that. Or in this case, it's gone into a bamboo stake that was put in the garden, and they're nesting in that. So they need some sort of pithy plant, and then they'll excavate the pith. Now, they will go in there, and many people, after they've cut their roses, you come back 2 or 3 weeks later, they see a hole in the cut stem and assumed it's a borer. It's not a borer. It's a bee, or in this case, a wasp that nests in the pith of the plant. So I don't have really great pictures of all this, but this is I think this, can't remember, this is either raspberry or ash. I think it's raspberry. But anyway, in this case, what we see is areas that have been excavated out of the pith. Now, before these pictures were taken, these were filled with small insects, probably leafhoppers in this case. So there may have been a half dozen to dozen paralyzed leafhoppers in this hole. She lays an egg. The young feeds on it and kills them all. There might be a few remnants of the body left over. This may have gone after flies, maybe. Anyway, this is a full-grown larva of the wasp. This is its pupa. And then next year it will come out. So that's a wasp larva. But they're not tunneling, they're not hurting the cane, they're just nesting in the pith. So these pithy plants can be very useful for providing nest sites for a lot of insects, bees and wasps, that's their natural place to nest. They like to excavate pith out of plants that are exposed through a cut or a damaged limb or whatever, and they nest in that and don't hurt the plant. There are borers that feed on the plant, the living part of the plant, but these are not borers. These are pith nesters. Anyway, these little canes can be really useful for encouraging these kinds of natural enemies. So every spring, and I was doing it this last weekend, if I'm doing pruning work on kinds of plants that do have a nice cane and pith inside it, or a branch that's got good pith, I keep those apart and make sure I don't toss those away. And then I put them out in the yard where I want to see them. So in this case, here's a little part of a garden, and I think these are raspberry. I think that could be butterfly bush. That's probably currant. Probably butterfly bush. Anyway, stuff like that. So I keep these around, stick them in the ground, and almost every one of these is occupied by something by the end of the summer. And then I leave them there, and then the next year everything's gone and they go away. This does bring up this subject we're hearing more and more about, in the leaves kind of thing. And again, I think there is value in keeping more debris around in the yard to provide places where things can winter. I like this too because it means I don't have to clean everything up as much too. So it's a bonus. But it could be wood piles or areas of brush that are you have a little brush pile in the back that's got some branches and some loosely packed leaves. You want them to be loose to make insulation. If you prune off some of these canes and other things, if they are not occupied, then you use them in some other place. And, in terms of where to put the leaves, you know, there's people who hear about this leave the leaves whole issue. Some of them get a little out of hand. They don't want to get rid of any leaf anywhere. No. You can get them off, you know, your lawn or areas where you've got little seedlings coming up. But where I think the best place to have the leaves concentrated is around some of the shrubbery. I mean, it's good for the shrubs, it insulates the shrubs, but it's also, the shrub is giving some cover. That's, if I was an insect, that's where I'd spend the winter. Not underneath a leaf on my front yard, but in an area like that. So anyway, leave the leaves. Anything that this guy here, Scott Hoffman, or Scott Hoffman Black, used to be Scott Hoffman, anyway, writes is great stuff, because he came from CSU. Anyway, how much time do I have? Okay, so moving on to another subject would be bees. Lots of kinds of bees. And I'm going to talk about honeybees, as I said, but the greatest number of bees that exist in this part of the world, and any part of the world, are solitary bees. And by that, I mean it's a bee where the mother does all the work. There's no colony. So the only ones that are not solitary bees are the honeybee, which is native to Europe and Africa and Asia, and bumblebees. And in Colorado, we got about 22 species of bumblebees. And we have 946 species of bees. That means 22 plus 1, 946, 923 of the bees we have in Colorado are solitary bees. They don't make a colony. Some are nesting in a pith of a plant, like the ones I showed you. Some of them are nesting in little cracks that exist in between rocks or lots of little other places, but most of them nest in the ground. So the life cycle of these is there's going to be the mother collecting nectar and pollen. First of all, she has made or found some little cavity, but she finds some place for rearing her young. She goes and collects nectar and pollen, because that's what bee young feed on, is nectar and pollen. Forms it into a little ball. When the ball's big enough, lays an egg on it. The egg hatches. The young stage feeds on that ball of nectar and pollen, consumes it entirely, becomes a pupa, and later comes out as an adult. Often one generation a year, though. They may just stop at this stage and come out next year, because many of the solitary bees have evolved with specific plants that flower at specific times. So, they'll have their one generation and then they go on a hold. They just stop growing until the next year has passed. Winter has passed into the next year. Almost all of the solitary bees, at least 2/3, probably more than that, nest in the soil. So they're going to be doing some kind of digging in the soil and making some sort of little gallery in the soil. And then there'll be little side chambers of some sort off that. And then that's what she's using to rear her individual young. So there'll be a little a ball of nectar pollen, and then an egg will be laid on it, a little young. And when they're full grown, they're in that chamber. Maybe they've pupated. But anyway. All you might see is just little diggings. And it could maybe look like ants. It could look like ground nesting hunting wasp, like I just talked about. But it could be ground nesting bees, and often is. Most of those holes would be ground nesting bees. So these are bees, some of which maybe you've heard of before, maybe others not. But these are the big groups of solitary bees. Ones that are called digger bees are some of the bigger ones. Some of them approach the size of a bumblebee, and they like to dig in the soil, as their name suggests. They will often nest in areas, nest in large groups, loose groups that are not connected at all in terms of activity, but at sites where it's just perfect for nesting. So they tend to like open areas, but maybe it has to have a little slope, and maybe it has to have the right soil texture and orientation to the sun and whatever. But if they find a site that is suitable, then maybe thousands and thousands may nest next to each other. And this is just a digger bee nesting site. This isn't a digger bee colony. She is working her site, she's working her site, she's working her site, that one, anyway. They're all separate individuals, just happening to nest the same place. So here's one down in southern Colorado. This is a nest site for cactus bees that come out when prickly pear cactus is in bloom, because that's what they are associated with. So can't remember the date when this was. Anyway, but you can see all the bees flying around. Most of the ones that are flying around are the males looking for the female to bother. The females are out collecting nectar and pollen, and then go right into their little hole. I'm not sure if there are any that were in this. These, by the way, are harmless bees. These are not going to sting you. First of all, the males can't sting. All the things that are flying around are the males, and males can't sting. If you've ever been stung, she did it to you. Anyway, there's nothing in it for them, too. I mean, if the insects that sting are colony-producing organisms, that some of the colony is tasked for defense. And they'll go out and they'll protect the colony, and they'll sting, and maybe they'll be killed. But the queen's safe. She's the queen. Why would she sting you? If you swatted her, it's the end of the line for her. Plus, the stinger they do have, and some of them you can get to sting if you try, it's just like a little pinprick. I mean, it's nothing. Anybody here heard of the Schmidt sting pain index? Okay, it's an index where this guy Justin Schmidt done many fine things in his career, but what he's going to be remembered for is the Schmidt sting pain index, where he got stung by as many things in the course of his life, so he could rank the pain on a 1 to 4 scale. So look it up. Anyway, the lowest pain of any stinging insect are these little solitary bees. Anyway, some other kinds of bees might make a little turret. You might see that. There's little tiny bees, some of them smaller than others, but the first bees I see in the spring are in this family, the Adrenidae, the Adrenid or mining bees. And they will be nesting in little holes in the ground, such as indicated here. Sweat bees. Some of the sweat bees are very brightly colored. Most of them are not. Some sweat bees are attracted to perspiration. I don't hear about that as a big problem in this part of the country, but that's the name. That's why they get their name. But here's a nest site for some sweat bees in a backyard patio. And there's one coming out. We're going in, and those are the little chambers underneath the ground that have been made. And there's a little pollen packet, and there's a little pollen packet with egg or young larva on it, feeding on others that are feeding on it. So this is somewhere underneath the ground. So these ground nesting bees, native, often are in open areas, bare soil, or maybe at the base of a plant, like a bunch grass, or base of a rock, or something. There might be a little cover, but they don't want much cover to get to them. So in general, if you want to encourage ground nesting bees, you want the habitat to look kind of more natural than that we have. I mean, this is the gardens in Spring Creek, one of the newer gardens they put there. And I think that's a great garden for being good nesting habitat for ground nesting bees, the way that one looks. There's a little bit of debris, and around the base of some of the plants there's some leaves and all, but in general there's lots of little protected spots where they could get in and make a little hole in the ground and not notice anything. People might not even notice that they're there. On the other hand, I go around the rest of the town, and everything's covered with like 3 inches of mulch, and that's not going to help. That's made that area unsuitable for nesting. You may have flowers there that the bees could get nectar and pollen from, but where are they going to nest? Nowhere, because you've covered up all the habitat. This is a quality pollinator habit at a university, which I won't mention, but starts with K and ends with Y. Anyway, anyway, this is their pollinator garden. The soil covered by mulch. All right, what pollinators are they talking about? Butterflies and moths, maybe? But then they have this, the butterfly houses. If they're, that's about the most bogus kind of item to have in a garden. I mean, I know of nobody who has ever seen a butterfly in a butterfly house. But you know what's in the butterfly houses now? You put one out, and it will be taken over by the European paper wasp, which loves little cavities. And the European paper wasp is the biggest assassin of butterfly larvae in this part of the world, or at least in Fort Collins. I mean, since they came in around 2001, they have wiped out caterpillars in my yard. I don't have problems with cabbage worms on my cabbage, hornworms on my tomatoes, or parsley worms and other caterpillars that turn into cool butterflies. They got them all. And they just love it. I mean, if I put one of those out, they'd be nesting in there. So then they could go and slaughter any caterpillars that were, so make it really, anyway. But that's just as a good reference, I think, this whole idea of on gardening for native bees in Utah and beyond, I think is a great publication. It is free. Utah State has an association with the USDA Native Bee Lab, and this talks about specific kinds of plants that are used by specific kinds of bees that we have around here. None of this East Coast stuff. I mean, it's based on what you're going to find in Wyoming and Utah and Colorado. And another book I really like is Bees in the Backyard. Bees are tough to identify. I mean, I thought they'd be easy. They're really tough to identify. Anyway, but this is, I think, my favorite book on how to identify some of those. We're supposed to quit in 3 minutes, right? Okay. So I guess that's all I'm going to talk about. I'll take questions, though, if anybody's got any questions on this. Yeah.
What would be some of the more, like, I guess, natural habitat plants kind of thing in this area you would recommend planting to encourage the pollinators in your yard?
Well, the bumblebees, which are very important, I would, if there's any kind of legumes, those are pretty good. And we've got some native legumes that occur here. But that is a general rule. Pretty deep, bumblebees like pretty deep things. You want things that are native plants, right?
Would yucca be something beneficial? Or?
Probably not. Yucca has its own moth. I mean, maybe. Foxgloves, they're not, I don't think they're native. Those are big, I can think of lots of, they have to be deep plants. Bumblebees have got pretty long mouth parts. So, I mean, I do see some early season legumes, but Solanaceae plants, I see them on that. Any kind of, so it could be nightshades and the like. They'll see them visiting the flowers, and what they'll do, bumblebees will, don't get a whole lot of nectar from those, but they get pollen, and they'll shake plants. They shake the pollen out. So there's a lot of plants that are bumblebee pollinated. Somebody when I just talked about this, talked about native plants. Yeah, I don't know. My lists often have European plants that they love, and they're easy to put in a garden. But for native ones, I'm just thinking legumes. Yeah.
When you're talking about you have to learn to identify pests different insects and that kind of stuff. Do you have any recommendations for where we could go or what we can use to help us identify?
For garden pests? Or
Yeah.
all,
Like if I see something in my garden, I don't really know what it is there a place I could go look?
well,
Book, or is there a app or anything
There is
like that?
apps. There are
There-
different apps. I found some.
and there's a great book called Garden Insects of North America, 2nd edition. I wrote it. It's got over 3,000 pictures. It's just all bugs in North America. But anyway, it's fun to look at. It's cheap. It's $35 retail, but it weighs close to 8 pounds. It's the cheapest insect book on the market per pound. And you can get it, Amazon. You can, but yeah, there's for insects on trees. In this part, there is an extension publication we wrote on insects that feed on trees and shrubs in the Central Rockies or Southern Rockies. I can't remember what it. Anyway, that's just insects on trees and shrubs. That's about 450 pages, but that's specific on trees and shrubs. Garden insects is everything. I don't know. There's apps too, but.
That was the CSU extension?
Yeah. So another question. One more.
You've seen the insect that targets Dalmatian toadflies.
Have I seen? I know that they're trying to introduce insects.
They're doing a very good job.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, they are, they're, because I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have toadflax in my house and I have released them and I've seen them. What happens is because they're a beneficial insect, they're not gonna completely take out their food source, right? They're just gonna control it a little bit. And so, again, they're just like every other insect though, where depending on the weather, depending on the climate, depending on all the things, they may overwinter or they may not overwinter, and then they'll spread accordingly.
Yeah.
We do have them.
Yeah. Sorry, don't know specifics on how well they're doing, but I know in Colorado they've got a facility with the Department of Ag where they release natural enemies for lots of insects and probably share it with Wyoming too. But I don't know. I haven't kept up with that since I quit the day job. So sorry.
Oh, Dr. Crenshaw.
Yep. Yeah.